In a secluded village on the outskirts of Okinawa, there stood an old orphanage known to the locals as a place of sorrow and mystery. Its walls were adorned with the echoes of children long gone, and its grounds held the whispers of legends too dark to be spoken aloud. The children who lived there were blissfully unaware of the orphanage's dark past, but all of that was about to change. The night was still. Inside the orphanage, the children were fast asleep, except for a young girl named Yui. Yui was a curious and brave child, always the first to explore and the last to retreat. That night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake off an uneasy feeling that had settled in her chest. Yui's unease was accompanied by a strange noise that seemed to come from the forest bordering the orphanage grounds. It was faint at first, almost like a distant echo, but it grew louder and more insistent. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, and listened intently. Unable to ignore the sound any longer, Yui decided to investigate. She slipped out of bed and tiptoed outside. The sight that met her eyes made her blood run cold. A tall white figure stood at the edge of a forest, its long dark hair cascading down its back. The figure seemed to be watching the orphanage, swaying gently as it let out the haunting sound. It was now a rhythmic chant, hypnotic and eerie. Yui felt a chill run down her spine as she locked eyes with the woman. The woman's lips curved into a sinister smile, revealing sharp, pointed teeth. Yui took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to run, but her feet seemed rooted to the ground. "Yui!" The shout snapped her out of her trance. It was Hiroshi, one of the older boys from the orphanage. He had followed her outside, worried about her safety. The tall woman turned her gaze to Hiroshi, and the air grew even colder. "Run!" Hiroshi yelled, grabbing her hand and pulling her away from the figure. The woman let out a shrill, bone-chilling scream and began to move towards them, her long limbs stretching unnaturally. They ran as fast as they could, the woman's screams echoing in their ears. They burst through the back door of the orphanage and slammed it shut behind them. The other children had woken up by now, their faces pale with fear as they huddled together in the common room. Suddenly, the windows shattered, and a gust of icy wind swept through the room. The tall figure loomed in the broken window, her eyes glowing with malevolent intent. She reached out a long clawed hand and in a blur of motion grabbed one of the children, a boy named Kenji who was standing closest to the window. The children screamed in terror as the woman lifted Kenji effortlessly, her jaw opening wide to reveal rows of sharp, glistening teeth. Kenji's screams were abruptly cut off as the spirit bit down, blood splattering across the room. The headmistress quickly took charge. She was a stern but kind woman, well versed in the local legends and protective rituals. She gathered the children around her and began to explain. "That was HACHISHAKUSAMA," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "An ancient spirit that preys on children. We must protect ourselves." She handed each child a protective talisman and instructed them to stay inside, no matter what they heard or saw. "When I was a young girl, I too encountered HACHISHAKUSAMA. She devoured my best friend before my eyes, and I was lucky to survive. Since then, I've dedicated my life to protecting children." She then drew a circle of salt around the common room and placed candles at each corner, chanting prayers to ward off the spirit. HACHISHAKUSAMA let out another ear-piercing scream, but was unable to penetrate the protective barrier. The candles flickered and then flared brightly, casting a blinding light that forced the spirit to retreat. The headmistress lowered her arms, exhausted but triumphant. "She is gone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The children slowly began to relax, though the fear still lingered in their eyes. The children, exhausted and traumatized, finally settled down to sleep, clutching their protective talismans tightly. In the middle of the night, Yui awoke with a startle. She could feel the presence in the room, something cold and malevolent. Her eyes darted around the dark room, and her heart raced as she heard a faint, familiar sound. She glanced around and saw Hiroshi, his eyes wide open and filled with terror, staring at the far corner of the room. There, standing in the shadows, was HACHISHAKUSAMA. Her tall white figure loomed over the sleeping children, her eyes glowing with a sinister light. Yui tried to scream, but no sound came out. She watched in horror as HACHISHAKUSAMA reached out and grabbed Hiroshi by the ankle, pulling him towards her. The other children woke up, their screams filling the room as they saw the horrifying scene unfold. The headmistress rushed into the common room, her face pale with fear and determination. She began chanting again, her voice rising in desperation. With all her strength, she threw a handful of salt at HACHISHAKUSAMA, causing the spirit to recoil and hiss in anger. The candles flared to life once more, casting a blinding light. HACHISHAKUSAMA released Hiroshi, who collapsed to the floor, his leg mangled and bleeding profusely. The spirit let out one final bone-chilling scream before disappearing into the shadows. The headmistress rushed to Hiroshi's side, applying pressure to his wound. "You're safe now," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The children gathered around, their faces pale with fear and relief. Despite the horror they had witnessed, they were grateful that Hiroshi was alive, though his leg was severely injured. Hours later, Hiroshi was resting in the infirmary. The other children had finally fallen asleep, still shaken by the night's events. The room was quiet, save for the soft breathing of sleeping children. Suddenly, Hiroshi's eyes snapped open, wide with terror. He let out a blood-curdling scream that jolted the other children awake. The headmistress rushed to his side, but before she could reach him, Hiroshi passed out again, his body limp and unresponsive. The children huddled together, fear gripping them once more. The headmistress tried to calm them, but her own heart was pounding with dread. As she turned to check on Hiroshi again, he suddenly sat up, his eyes dark and empty. He murmured, a sinister smile spreading across his face. The children screamed in unison, the sound echoing through the orphanage as the terrifying realization set in. HACHISHAKUSAMA hadn't been banished after all. She had found a new vessel. The room plunged into chaos, the children crying out in fear and confusion. The headmistress stared in horror at Hiroshi, who continued to chant the eerie sound. Hiroshi's body convulsed violently, his limbs twisting at grotesque angles. His skin began to blister and crack, oozing dark blood. His eyes rolled back, and an unearthly wail escaped his face. The children screamed and backed away, but the doors and windows were sealed by an unseen force. The room filled with the sickening sound of bones snapping and flesh tearing as Hiroshi's transformation continued. With a final bone-chilling scream, Hiroshi's body began to grow taller, elongating grotesquely. He transformed into HACHISHAKUSAMA, with eyes glowing with malevolent delight. She towered over the children, her long clawed fingers dripping with Hiroshi's blood. She chanted louder, her voice reverberating through the walls. The headmistress stepped forward, positioning herself between the children and the monster. The children scrambled behind her, their faces pale with fear. The nightmare was far from over.